Hmm. Well, I'm just saying, Deepak Striders.
Yes. Okay. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Meenal Shirsagar, Chairperson of the Endowment Lectures Committee. And on behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I welcome you to the 15th Dr. Mani Kamerkar Endowment Lecture. Today, we have the honor of having as our speaker Dr. Miles Taylor, Professor of Modern History at the University of York in the UK. He will deliver his lecture titled The Empire of Namak, Salt and the Rise and Fall of the British Raj, where he will tell us how Mahatma Gandhi at Dandi on the 6th April 1930 shook the foundations of the British Empire. We also have the privilege of having with us Dr. Prashant Kidambi, Associate Professor of Colonial Urban History at the University of Leicester in the UK. I would now like to tell you a little about Dr. Mani Padmakar Kamerkar. She was born Mani Vasunya in October 1925 in a well-established Parsi family. She spent the first 12 years of her life in Kobe, Japan, since her father was in business there. After returning to India, she finished her education at St. Mary's School, Pune, and then joined college in Bombay in 1942, graduating in history and politics from Elphinstone College. At that time, the freedom movement was in full swing. Women were often in the limelight. Mani got involved with political groups in the college and on many occasions attended public meetings of Gandhi, Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel and others, soon becoming an ardent nationalist. She joined the Socialist Party and worked in the trade union movement, where she met her husband, Padmakar Kamerkar, who later became an eminent labor lawyer working for social causes. They were married in 1950 in a civil marriage ceremony. She was Parsi, he was Maharashtrian. And after that, Mani continued with her teaching work as University Professor of History, Modern South Asia, concentrating in particular on social history, especially dealing with Parsis. She later became the founder principal of the Maniben Nanavati Women's College from 1972 to 85 and director, College Development Council of the SNDT University from 1986 to 1990. She took up serious historical research and writing on Western India and has several publications in books and reputed journals to her credit. She was well known in history circles as an authority on the colonial period. Mani joined the Asiatic Society of Bombay in 1961 and rose to be a vice president in 1993. She had completed her PhD in 1976 and was recognized as a PhD guide. Since 1981, she had been a trustee of Avehi, an audiovisual resource center disseminating material to schools and adult education centers. She was president of the Women Graduates Union, Bombay chapter of the Indian Federation of University Women for many years. And she was actively involved with several leading societies in the field of historical studies, which included being chairperson, India History and Culture Society in 1990. Dr. Mani Kamerkar passed away in Mumbai in October 2004 at the age of 79 years. She is survived by her son Anand and her daughter Jyoti Chinoy, who are both here with us today. In her will, she left a generous endowment for the Asiatic Society. It was a passion and a commitment that was dear to her heart. An endowment lecture in her name has been held every year from 2007. The subject has to have a bearing on the history of India. Long list of publications, which I will not go into here. To to tell you a little about Dr. Miles Taylor. So he's a professor of modern history at the University of York in the UK. He joined the department in 2004, having studied history at Queen Mary University of London, Harvard, where he was a Kennedy Scholar, and Cambridge, where he gained his PhD in 1989. He had previously held chairs at the University of Southampton, King's College London, and Cambridge. Between 2008 and 2014, he was seconded to the University of London as director of the Institute of Historical Research. During 2014 to 16, he was the holder of a sabbatical Leverhulme Trust Major Research Award. He's a member of the Research Advisory Committee of the National Portrait Gallery and sits on the editorial advisory board of the Journal of British Studies. Recently, he was commissioned by Cambridge University Press to be the general editor of its new 5-volume History of Britain. His main area of expertise is Victorian Britain. His recent books include The English Maharani, Queen Victoria and India, published in 2008 by Penguin. And in 2020, he co-edited The Utopian Universities, A Global History of the New Campuses of the 1960s. The lecture we will hear today is derived from a larger research project on salt, protest, and public health in modern India, a collaborative venture between the University of York, the Gandhi Research Foundation in Jalgaon, and Ambedkar University in Delhi. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Miles. And now to introduce Dr. Prashant Kidambi. He is Associate Professor of Colonial Urban History at the University of Leicester. After completing postgraduate degrees in history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to pursue a doctorate at the University of Oxford. Dr. Kidambi's research explores the interface between British imperialism and the history of modern South Asia. In addition to numerous publications on the history of Bombay, he is the author of Cricket Country, An Indian Odyssey in the Age of Empire, published in July 2019. Thank you, Dr. Kidambi, for being with us. And I now hand over the proceedings to you. We look forward to a meaningful discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Meenal. It's a great pleasure to be asked to take part in this event. As Meenal has just recounted, Professor Miles Taylor navigates very skillfully and with great insight both the worlds of British history and South Asian history. And I'm very much looking forward to this particular talk because I think it brings together his interests in both British India and Britain. And so I sort of hand over straight away to you, Miles.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Please, can the administrator let me know if there's any problems in the transmission? So it's a great pleasure to be asked to give the 15th Mani Kamerkar lecture. It's a very great honor. I know some of her work on Western India and Gujarat, and that is quite appropriate to my theme this evening. And it's very nice to learn that some of her family are here this evening as well. Thank you to Meenal and all her colleagues at the Society for inviting me and for arranging these remote proceedings. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you, but I feel I'm there in spirit. And to help me on my way, I have Buddha looking over my shoulder. I'm also conscious that you had a lecture on a similar topic last year by my good friend Jayanta Sengupta on food in India. I think he's left me some room on the plate to talk about salt, and that is what I'm going to do for the next 45 minutes or so. I'm just going to share my screen with you as I have a PowerPoint. So, in March 1930, the Indian nationalist Mohandas Gandhi led 79 of his followers on a protest march across the region of Gujarat in Western India. The march lasted 3.5 weeks and covered nearly 250 miles from Gandhi's ashram in Ahmedabad to Dandi, a small village on the coast of the Arabian Sea. Gandhi and his supporters, the Satyagrahis, were demonstrating against the salt tax, a law enforced by the British government in colonial India, which required everyone, even the very poor, to pay tax on the salt they consumed. The Salt March was one of the most significant acts of resistance to British imperial rule. It inspired civil disobedience in other countries. For example, the Jarrow March of the Unemployed in Britain in 1936, and the March on Washington, D.C. in 1963, led by the US civil rights leader, Martin Luther King. Now, in 2020, 90 years later, both Gandhi himself and the birth of the Indian Republic in 1947 are commemorated around the world by the symbolism of the Salt March. But why salt? On reaching Dandi on the 6th of April 1930, Gandhi plucked a handful of muddy salt from the seashore and declared that by breaking the salt laws, he was, quote, shaking the foundations of the British Empire. How was this so? Why did salt represent all that was wrong about British colonial rule in India? Whilst we know a lot about the Salt March of 1930, not least because of the frequent reenactments of that long walk, surprisingly less has been researched and written about how and why salt became so important to the British Raj. This is the subject of my lecture this evening. It's in 3 parts. I begin in Bengal in the late 18th century, with the massive fortunes made from salt by the so-called English nabobs, nabob being a corruption of nawab, and Indian merchants. Then I look at the operation of the British salt monopoly in the 19th and early 20th century. And finally, I return to Gandhi's campaign against salt, not just in 1930, but its revival in 1942 at the height of the Second World War, as the Indian National Congress called for Britain to quit India and a terrible famine devastated Bengal. In 1757, Robert Clive, East India Company official and army lieutenant colonel, defeated Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab Nizam of Bengal, at the Battle of Plassey, 100 miles to the north of Calcutta. So began the full British occupation of India, as the East India Company, hitherto a corporation that mainly traded out of Madras and Bombay, now began to penetrate into the interior of the Indian subcontinent. Bengal supplied the company with the cash required to fund this step change in its activities. The Nawab of Bengal's rights to raise revenue from his territory were handed over to the company. The combination of rents from the land and the profits from a thriving trade in cottons, indigo, jute, silk, and opium transformed the region around Calcutta from a small urban outpost to a populous emporium of almost 500,000 people by 1800. It wasn't all plain sailing. Fighting and trading at the same time is not a good business model. By the 1780s, the company was in financial trouble, and Warren Hastings, the Governor General of Bengal, was facing impeachment back in London for corruption and mismanagement of company rule. And there you see him in a famous cartoon of Gilray with Edmund Burke on one side, his accuser, and Charles James Fox on the other. It's no exaggeration to say that salt saved Hastings, for salt was another of the assets that the Nawab Nizam gave up to the British, and everyone made money out of salt. Even the poor Molongi, the salt worker, who was offered inducements of salt in kind if he informed on any neighbour who was making salt illegally. The zamindars and ryots, who rented out the land where the salt manufacture took place, the agents appointed by the British to collect the rent and revenue, the merchants and auctioneers who sold and traded the salt, all took their cut. Indeed, some of the British agents insisted on being paid in gold, not cash or credit, for their commission. In 1789, the salt revenue of Bengal amounted to £960,000. That's around £75 million in today's values. That is to say, around 73,000 lakh of rupees. And that was just 1 year's worth of income from salt taxes, way ahead of the revenue derived from opium and other goods. That sum alone, it was reckoned by those who defended Hastings at his impeachment trial, would pay all the dividends of the East India Company to its shareholders, clear its debts, and leave some to spare. Now, as you can imagine, there were many Englishmen who made a fortune out of such a lucrative business. Hastings and Clive led the pack, but a recent research project led by Margot Finn at University College London, called the East India Company at Home, has revealed other riders in the race. For example, Sir Francis Sykes, who oversaw the trade for the company in and out of Kazim Bazar, a key town some 30 miles up the Hooghly River from Plassey. In just 3.5 years, Sykes accumulated huge wealth, most of it from salt and related revenues. Like many then and since, he took his money with him when he left India, buying estates in Yorkshire, then later in Berkshire. This particular Basildon Park estate is quite controversial at the moment because the National Trust now owns it and has been revealing the links between Sykes and extraction of wealth from Bengal. He also bought a seat in the House of Commons. Another rapid rise to riches was Anselm Beaumont, who managed the company's salt trade in Midnapur, a town on the Kangsabati River, about 40 miles west of the main Hooghly Delta. He returned to Britain with £70,000, 18th century values, bought an estate in Staffordshire, probably helped out Josiah Wedgwood in his pottery business, helped out financially, and spent the rest of his life collecting books and sculptures on the European tour circuit. But of course, it was not only the amphibious English who profited from the salt trade in Bengal in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Bengali merchants made fortunes too. You will be familiar with some of the names. Krishna Kanta Nandi, known as Kantu Babu, Dwarkanath Tagore, uncle of Rabindranath, and the Malaks of Bara Bazar. Again, we are now finding out much more about the interlocking wealth of these families and where it came from. Sayoko Kanda, a historian of Keio University in Japan, her research has added several more names, men who are heavily involved in the salt business, including Biswanath Motilal in the north of the city, Motilal Seal, nicknamed the Rothschild of Calcutta, whose local philanthropy can still be seen in modern Kolkata in the shape of Motilal Seal's Free School and College on CR Avenue. And there are others too. And there are a couple of points worth noting here. Firstly, although most of these Bengali merchants ended up in the export trade, benefiting from the economic hegemony that Britain asserted around the Bay of Bengal, and then increasingly further east, sorry, I've lost my slide, further east. So there you can see a map of Bengal in the 1750s, and you can see from the nomenclature and some of the other details there that Britain was competing with France, with Denmark, with the Marathas, for that trade. But by the end of the 18th century, Britain is controlling not only the Bay of Bengal, but further east to Burma, the Strait settlements, China, and the Indonesian archipelago. All of them, all of these merchants, whilst they benefited from that expansion of trade, they started out in salt or saltpeter. Saltpeter is potassium nitrate, the essential element in gunpowder, to which I shall return. The second point that's worth making is that salt was not for export. It was not a staple like cotton or an intoxicant like opium. It did not rely on fickle market demand, the hazards of sea voyages, or any significant competition. The salt trade was a trade in one of life's necessities in one of the most populous parts of the world. By raking off revenue at every point in the manufacture and sale of salt, the East India Company had found its golden goose. India was literally a captive market. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the company had established paramountcy over the various riverine and littoral areas of salt production across the three presidencies, again looking at this map, but then further around all of coastal India. The French gave up their salt industry along the Madras and Coromandel coastline in 1817, and with the annexation of the Punjab in 1849, Britain gained access to the Koh-i-Noor of salt in South Asia, the salt range around Jhelum, which to this day produces the famous pink Himalayan salt. And as that second slide there shows, almost as soon as the Sikh dynasty was deposed in Lahore, the British began surveying in the mountains, looking to expand activity in the mineral deposits, in the mines there. Only the Portuguese colony of Goa held on to its own salt industry after 1815, and it too was hooked into the British system later on in 1878. The golden goose, in other words, just got fatter and fatter, but also more cumbersome. Salt administration varied from presidency to presidency, different rates of duty applied, and a complex system evolved of transit barriers and customs lines, transit duties and customs barriers. For example, the famous Great Hedge, there marked out in green, to control the movement of salt around India, and in particular to prevent smuggling. Now, the trouble for the company was that other Britons wanted a share of the profits. The 1840s saw the coming of free trade into Britain. Protective tariffs were abandoned, the famous Corn Laws, customs and excise overhauled, monopolies dissolved. The salt mine owners of Cheshire, shipping merchants of Liverpool, lobbied hard to end the East India Company's control of the salt trade, and eventually they got their way, supplying between 1/3 and 1. Hatton reversed Bengal's dominant position as a second source of salt, turning it into a region that was effectively, as Professor Ray observes, a process of deindustrialization, superior quality British. However, it took the rebellion of 1857 to speed up this takeover, this switch away from Bengal. Companies blamed for what let me digress briefly to say something about salt of 1857, or rather say something about saltpeter. India may have produced a lot of salt, but it dominated the world's supply of saltpeter, the ashy substance found in large deposits in Malwa, in modern-day Uttar Pradesh, across other parts of the kingdom of Oudh or Awadh, and all of that trade as well. And Purbiya troops from Malwa, adept in the use of saltpeter gunpowder, filled the regiments of the company's Bengal army. All sat atop a powder keg, quite literally, for saltpeter or gunpowder was in the personal possession of every single sepoy or soldier of the company. And of course, in 1857, that powder keg exploded. We're all familiar with the story of how the greasing of cartridges with animal fat so offended both Hindu and Muslim troops in Bengal and Awadh that they mutinied. But we tend to forget the other end of the bullet, the gunpowder. In the early stages of the rebellion in April and May 1857, Purbiya's soldiers led the attacks on officers, the ransacking of arsenals, and the raids on other barracks. they were looking for arms and ammunition. Securing the supply of powder became a key strategy for all the rebels across northern India. Mostly they failed. In a recent article, Tatanka Roy, economic historian at the London School of Economics, has shown how the merchants of Awadh and elsewhere remained loyal, refusing to trade in saltpeter with the rebels, instead ensuring that Britain's allies were properly supplied. In other words, salt in the form of saltpeter was a lethal weapon. Neutralizing its use helped secure the empire in the 1850s. Once the rebellion of 1857 had been brutally suppressed, the new viceroy, Charles Canning, slapped the first ever All India restriction on a salt derivative. Act number 31, passed by the Viceroy's Council, seen there a few years later after Canning died, Lawrence is the Viceroy. Act number 31 of 1861 required that going forward, all saltpeter manufacture had to be licensed all across the country. The early 1860s were a turning point for salt production in India more generally. The coming of the railways, the professionalization of the European element in the Indian civil service, and the extension of free trade to India all had an impact on how salt was produced, distributed, and taxed. And indeed, a couple of the British men that we particularly associate with some of those changes, Charles Trevelyan and John Strachey, can be found around the table of the council in that photograph. One thing didn't change, though, in the era, the first decades of Crown government, and that was the golden goose. If anything, British extraction of revenue from salt now went into overdrive. In 1878, following similar developments in Europe, the German Zollverein, for example, the Italian Dogana, the Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, tore down the hedge, abolished most of the inland customs, and equalized the salt duty across northern and southern India. And I think actually, just to digress, it is important that it's Lytton because he does have a lot of knowledge and experience of Europe as a diplomat in the 1850s and 60s, precisely around the time that customs barriers were coming down. Anyway, this was the beginning of the unified salt monopoly of the Raj, which lasted until 1947. Production of salt ended in Bengal in 1862 and later in Orissa, modern-day Odisha, in 1898, and was concentrated, as the map on the right of the screen there shows, along the Bombay and Madras coastlines, later the Irrawaddy Delta of Burma, the lakes of Rajasthan around Jaipur and Jodhpur, and in the mountains of the Punjab, to which I've already referred. A treaty with Portugal, also in 1878, turned Goa's salt industry over to the British. All domestic salt was, going forward, produced either under license or directly for the government of India. Princely states which had formerly controlled their own salt manufacture, such as Cambay in Bombay, or Jaipur and Jodhpur in Rajasthan, were compensated by the British when they relinquished the trade. There were some significant exceptions to this process of negotiating with princely states, giving them compensation, cash or salt, or a mixture of both, in return for the revenue. Next door to Cambay in Bombay Presidency was Kathiawar, that's up over the Gulf there of Cambay, which kept its own independent salt manufacture. Much of it was centered around Porbandar, birthplace of Mohandas Gandhi, where his father and Karamchand's father too served as diwans in the court of the local chief, the Rana. How ironic! Gandhi grew up in one of the few regions of British India where salt was free. In fact, this is an interesting map because it's part of a larger map showing the administrative districts of India. And in the legend on the right there, you can see Taluka office and collector's bungalow. But then if you look at the map, you can't find any of those apparatus of the administration because, as I say, this was a part of India that was free from salt regulation. Gandhi also gave up eating salt, but of course that is a story for another day. Now, what is quite remarkable about salt in colonial India, for me, thinking about it comparatively, is that the British were rolling out the state monopoly of salt production, just as most other countries were giving it up. The most notorious salt tax of all, the gabelle of Bourbon France, was swept away with most of the rest of the Ancien regime in the French Revolution of 1789. Salt monopolies remained in place in Austria, centered on the famous royal mines of Salzburg, and in the Ottoman Empire, the practice of Tuz Resmi tax farming, which actually I think is part of the model originally for the East India Company in Bengal, as well as in Romania and Italy. But in other places, salt monopolies were on their way out. Even the British reduced the salt tax in Egypt, where after they occupied the country in 1882. So when Lytton rolled out the salt tax in 1878, back in London, alarm bells began to ring. A bad thing in France, warned Henry Fawcett in the House of Commons, did not make a good thing in India. Morality may have been on Fawcett's side, but the iron laws of finance were not. The government of India maximized income streams over the next few decades from salt, just as the Nabobs had done 100 years earlier. In 1880, the average return was a massive 2,032%. That is to say, the net revenue as a proportion of the cost of collection. This dipped below 2,000 in the 1900s, but only really began to fall off in the years after the First World War. Now, to work properly, the new salt monopoly required a rigid degree of control, both to prevent unlicensed manufacture and trade and to ensure collection of the revenue. Salt workers and salt traders, some of them seen here, for example, at the Lake Samba. Salt workers and salt traders, such as the Golars and the Banjaras of the salt lakes and salt routes of Rajasthan, were targeted by this new regime. As my colleague, Ambedkar University's Tanuja Kotial, with whom I'm collaborating on the larger research project from which this lecture is derived, as she's shown in her marvelous book, published by Cambridge in 2016, Nomadic Narratives, A History of Mobility and Identity in the Great Indian Desert, the manufacture and trading of salt was criminalized in places like Rajasthan. The Banjaras joined the long list of castes prescribed by the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. Elsewhere, the new system of salt regulation, took on the character of some dystopian narrative as surveillance crept into every aspect of the supply line. Take, for example, the Bombay coastline, where a system of barges and boats, lighthouses, inspectors on foot and horseback patrolled the salt pans of that region, of the coastline, the North Konkan coastline in particular, but also increasingly around the city of Bombay. In the northwest, the salt range of the Punjab, there on the left, was routinely depicted by artists as a desolate part of British India, but its mines were protected like Fort Knox. 32 inspectors, 1,265 men policed the operation in the mid-1880s. And as Samita Agar in New York has shown in her research, the Punjab mines saw a particularly violent form of protection and prevention. Government salt factories, mainly to be found in Bombay, were run like Victorian prisons or pauper workhouses. No workers were allowed to reside or sleep within the vicinity of the factory. They were searched on entry and exit. No licensed production or trading of salt could take place within 1 mile of a factory. All of these rules are laid out in the manuals. Here's a later one in the 1920s that were produced by the Salt Commission. There were some exceptions to these very strict rules. Manufacturers of salted fish did not have to pay the salt duty, but if they carried out their only if they carried out their curing of fish in government factories according to specified techniques for which they were charged overheads. Those of you in modern universities are very familiar with overheads, but anyway, the fish curers were charged an overhead of a rate of half a rupee per morn. Workers who did the curing at sea curing of the fish, that is to say with a fresh catch on the boat, had to buy the duty salt and then claim a rebate after the sale of the fish, and so on. It's an incredible industrialization of production and management of the labor process. It recalls, for me, the description of the pin factory in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, all that division of labor and very overseen process of manufacture. Some of you may know, actually, that Adam Smith was, in fact, Commissioner of Scottish Customs and the Salt Duties for a dozen years, following the publication of his famous book, The Great Free Trader. Actually turned out to be a salt commissioner. Salt gets everybody in the end. The penal code in relation to the breaking of salt laws, also set out in the manual there, was even told that escape detection. There were still prosecutions taking place against villages in low-lying coastal areas, like this one famously depicted early 19th century, whose houses had been flooded with salt water, leaving them quite unintended with a pile of salt on their doorstep. There were still people being taken to court for that entirely, and in the same powers of inspection, house entering, and arrest as the officers of the Plague Commission and the police. Any breach of the salt laws incurred a 500 rupees fine or 6 months hard labour in prison. Conviction rates were horribly impressive, always above 95% in the two main jurisdictions of Madras and Bombay. The sheer scale of the salt administration, its disciplines of control, regulation, punishment, really does await its historian. It conjures up the sort of image we associate with Michel Foucault's classic studies of total institutions. Now, in these ways, the various salt commissions, which became one of the largest departments of the Indian civil service by 1900, with, I estimate, around 20,000 employees, made salt pay. There were no new nabob fortunes, but the finances of the government of India were stabilised. For the British defended the salt duty as a form of ready cash reserve to be raised or lowered according to the general health of the rest of the finances. The salt duty in this way proved reliable and flexible. In the last quarter of the 19th century, it yielded the most of all the excise taxes, more than opium, more than abkari, liquor, toddy, more than stamp duty, around 30% by the 1890s. The table here shows you the main alterations during the period. As you can see, it was highest in the 1890s when British finances in India at their most parlous, and again, albeit briefly, in 1923 to 4, which I shall come back to shortly. On both occasions, the salt duty was increased in order to offset a projected budgetary deficit. For example, 1878, when Lytton needed money, ready money to fight the Second Afghan War. So the British regulation of salt confounded the critics like Fawcett. It confounded those who said, we're going to have another Gabelle, we're going to have another French Revolution. Indeed, so efficient, so durable and profitable was the salt tax in late 19th century India that it was exported to China. In 1913, Sir Richard Morris Dane, the first Inspector General of Excise and Salt in India, was invited to Beijing to overhaul the Chinese salt administration, and that's precisely what he did. With some degree of success, the system lasted in China through the nationalist period and into the early years of communism. Now, the salt monopoly after 1878 depended not only on a rigid management regime in India, but also drew in other countries and specific parts of the British Empire. Imported salt was a very important part of the process. For most of the period down to 1914, imported salt came into India mainly from Britain. Then, with the opening of the Suez Canal, in 1869, the amount of imported salt increased from Port Said in Egypt and from Aden too, as well as from the Ottoman Empire, from the Red Sea, from the Caspian Sea, later on from British possessions in Eastern Africa. So empire was being used as a resource also to make the system of salt regulation work in India. Now the salt monopoly, final point about the monopoly, and it is the key one, assumed the acquiescence of the ordinary Indian. The British acted on the premise that Indians had no objection to the salt tax. They shouldered their burden ungrudgingly, ungrudging Indian, as the secretary to the Punjab government expressed it in 1859. This was partly because the duty was an indirect tax hidden away in the price of salt, passed on by licensed manufacturers, the government factories, the importing merchants. It was contained in the high price of salt. But it was also because the British persuaded themselves that Indians did not need much salt compared to Europeans. A whole discipline, a whole sub-discipline of political economy and social investigation developed in colonial India, devoted to finding out just how little salt Indians needed. Prison diet, famine relief, the biodata of army recruits became sites for this salt surveillance investigation. The figure of around 10 pounds of salt per annum, around 4.5 kilos, or around 12 grams, just under 1/2 of an ounce per day. Sorry, I do both metric and imperial, being the age I am, was settled on as a standard estimate in the 1820s and 1830s, and was still being cited 100 years later. And that tiny amount of salt was supposed to stretch around a family, and if need be, feed working cattle as well, and other livestock. Experts, and there are a lot of them on the salt consumption in the 19th century, also pointed out that the demand for salt was inelastic, as the economists call it. In other words, everyone consumed the same amount, whatever the price. Again, this assumption arose out of a fiscal consideration rather than a nutritional one. The salt duty was viewed as a kind of poll tax, that was the phrase that was used. Everyone in India was liable to pay it, as everyone consumed salt. It was a necessity, like air and water. Therefore, it followed that everyone consumed the same amount of salt. Perhaps surprisingly, only gradually did Indian reformers challenge this notion that the burden of the salt tax fell equally on the poor as it did on everyone else. So, for example, early meetings of the Indian National Congress in the 1880s, what they didn't like about the salt tax, there it is, one of the bundles under the elephant, was that it was used to finance wars. It's only really with the emergence of arguments such as this one of Gokhale, the Joint Secretary of the Indian National Congress, who began to point out that the high price of salt had a disproportionate effect on poorer people than it did on rich. And of course, this is the lesson that is heeded by Gandhi many years later. Now, like many aspects of the British imperial economy, the salt monopoly of India entered a difficult period after the First World War. Maritime imports of salt fell away by around 40%, obviously the interruption in sea voyage and impact on overland travel. The profit margins in salt collection receded, and there were reports of salt shortages in northern India, mainly in the Punjab and in the region around Agra and the towns of Awadh, the so-called United Provinces. Right after the war, there were clear salt shortages. So in Sindh, for example, the salt regulations were set on one side for some trades. The British, or rather the Bombay government, really tried to, for example, maximize salt production around the city, developing, particularly in the north of Bombay, but also Chowpatty Beach and some of the main river estuary was turned over to more salt pans. And there you can see them in a nice newspaper photograph from the mid-1920s with their monsoon coats on. Research stations were established to investigate new techniques of solar evaporation in Burma in particular, but elsewhere in India too. So after the war, there's a great attempt to try and maximize output from salt production to make up for the loss of imports. The British also hastened the development of magnesium chloride industry, only to find that the manufacturers were not happy to pay the salt duty. They wanted to be free of any kind of customs. But despite these new economic realities and initiatives, the government of India remained needy and greedy. In 1922, it proposed doubling the salt duty to help meet a shortfall in income for that year. The non-official members of the Legislative Assembly resigned, and it went away. But the following year, the proposed hike in the salt duty came back, and this time the Viceroy, Lord Reading, used his new power of veto for the first time since the Government Act of 1919 to push the measure through. And I think that's an interesting turning point, because really for the first time in the history of the salt monopoly, the power of the Viceroy, the constitutional status of the Viceroy, is associated with the salt duty, and it earns him a lot of criticism. The matter of salt abolition is then referred to a taxation inquiry committee. It reports in 1928. It doesn't say abolish the salt duty, but interestingly, it does say that India needed to become self-sufficient in salt production. In other words, free itself from dependence on foreign, including British, supply. And much that same case was put forward by a very influential report of the Calcutta Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, published right at the beginning of 1930 and perused and read before publication by Gandhi and other members of the Indian National Congress. Its recommendations were very radical: abolish the salt duty, remove the licensing system, impose a tariff on foreign salt, and let India prosper from the manufacture and consumption of a mineral which was already in abundant supply. It's not really a manifesto, but this monograph, which was very quickly translated into Bengali and into Hindi, furnished the Salt March with a convincing rationale. It's not the rights of man, but it's the rights of man in relation to salt. So when Gandhi took to the road on the 12th of March, 1930, here he is leaving Ahmedabad, the British salt monopoly was probably at its weakest point. Its revenue yield was down, the cost of collection was up, and the ballast supplied by imports of salt from overseas were no longer so reliable. Indeed, Indian salt manufacturers from Karachi to Calcutta had found their own voice, and they were pressing for import duties. There was no better time to strike than when the animal was wounded, and that is what Gandhi, I think, did with the Salt March. I don't want to say too much about that amazing event. In partnership with my friends at the Gandhi Research Foundation in Jalgaon, I've curated an online exhibition about the march to mark the 90th anniversary, and that goes live very soon. But it is worth thinking about what the Salt March achieved and what happened next. In one sense, not very much was achieved, in spite of, or perhaps because of, all the publicity showered on Gandhi in 1930. The salt tax remained in place, as did the salt monopoly. In fact, the government of India went one step further, and in 1935 unified the Salt Revenue Administration under one central secretariat, doing away with the separate revenue commissions of each presidency. By the mid-1930s, salt revenue was once again propping up the finances of the Raj, yielding 13% of all taxation. That includes the land tax. But in other ways, the Salt March changed everything. Gandhi met the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, in March 1931. Declining a cup of tea, he said, with a mischievous glint in his eye, that he'd rather have a glass of nimbu pani with a pinch of salt. Gandhi wrought a major concession from the British, namely that villagers could collect and sell both earth and sea salt as long as they did not trade it outside their locality. Of course, he had to give a lot in return, but that was a major take-home point from the meeting in Delhi. So the draconian system of salt surveillance, the so-called preventive measures, were no longer enforced. The Indian Post Office now took over the supervision of licenses in much the same way as it sold stamps and salt that I described earlier continued. In the 1930s, 2/3 of salt manufacture now lay in the hands of independent license holders. I think this is a very important shift, with government production confined to the mines of the Punjab, the lakes of Rajasthan, and a handful of large factories on the North Konkan coast and in Kutch, such as at Karagoda. The lobbying of the Indian salt industry was also reaping dividends in the years after the march to Dandi. The Salt Additional Import Duty Act of 1931 helped protect domestic producers at the expense of foreign salt, including salt from Britain. And in that sense, I mean, it's not a moment of Swadeshi, it's not a boycott of overseas salt, but it is, in placing a tariff on salt imports, the government of India was giving in to what had been a major demand of Indian nationalists since the time of Dadabhai Naoroji in the 1890s. So by the end of the 1930s, virtually all salt imported into India was coming, in fact, from Aden, from modern-day Yemen, and most of it was going into Bengal. And it was in Bengal during the Second World War that the final fatal turn of the screw in the story of salt in the British Raj was to occur. And in the last 7 or 8 minutes of my talk, I'm just going to turn to that now. In May 1942, Gandhi, who was staying at the Sevagram Ashram near Nagpur, began to receive news from Indian National Congress colleague Rajendra Prasad of salt shortages in Bihar and Bengal and price racketeering in Calcutta. Within weeks, this is early summer 1942, Gandhi was warning of, quote, an impending salt famine in Bengal. The concessions granted by Irwin in the Delhi Pact were not working. The area around villages where salt could be collected freely needed to be extended. Intervention was required to stop profiteering. Salt was back at the centre of nationalist politics. When the Indian National Congress announced in August 1942 that it wanted the British to quit India, Gandhi resumed salt satyagraha as the key element in the new campaign for independence, not just as civil disobedience, but also out of fears of a looming crisis in the salt supply of Bengal, once the heart of the Indian salt trade, but now totally dependent on imports. Gandhi's instructions to civil resistors, drafted in August 1942, called for villagers to make their own salt and to defy inspectors and collectors. Now, what happened next is well known. The arrests of the Indian National Congress leadership, the terrible famine that sets in Bengal, the devastating cyclone in November 1942, and the scorched earth policy that Britain used to defend India against the Japanese forces overrunning Burma. 3 million people perished in Bengal as rice production collapsed, the area around Midnapur suffering the most. But in all that has been written about the Bengal famine of 1943, little attention has been paid to the question of salt. And yet there was indeed a salt element to the famine. And here Prasad and Gandhi foretold the scale of the tragedy that unfolded. Salt imports into Bengal dried up in the war. Salt stores ran out quickly. Small salt producers and merchants joined the starving and dying on the streets of Calcutta. The hastily drawn up famine manual of 1943 severely limited the daily allowance of salt, much lower than in any previous famine, such in Bengal, such as in the 1870s and the 1890s. Winston Churchill's government, the government of India, as well as the provincial authorities, all smothered news of the famine, euphemistically referring to it throughout as the, quote, food situation in India, which of course it was. There wasn't any. And as the war was ending, in May 1945, an official report whitewashed the British of most of the responsibility of the famine, helpfully pointing out, with no sense of irony, that there was scope in Bengal to develop its own salt industry and avoid scarcity in the future. The estuaries of the Hooghly, the Brahmaputra rivers, the report suggested might support the production of salt as well as rice. History had come full circle with a terrible vengeance. Bengal, once the salt seller of South Asia, was being told to support itself. Well, just under 2 years later, early in 1947, the interim government under Sir Archibald Wavell, the Viceroy, abolished the salt tax. It was the only tax ever removed by the British. Historians often miss this. When we read that the salt tax finally went in 1947, we usually assume it was one of the first acts of independence, first acts of independent India. In fact, it was one of the last actions of the Raj, the negotiations taking place overseen by this man, Harry Greenfield, chairman of the Central Board of Revenue, with whom Gandhi struck up a good working relationship. And I think Greenfield is crucial because he warns Gandhi that if you go from a state monopoly to no regulation, there might be profiteering and price fixing. And so by 1947, Gandhi came round to the idea of some state control alongside the free production of salt. And that, of course, is what took place. Although the invidious salt tax was abolished in 1947, the new Indian government took over the old colonial monopoly, regulating salt production and supply across the Indian subcontinent through a handful of corporations, some of which on the slide still exist today. Since then, state control of the salt industry in India has waxed and waned. The old colonial licensing system was finally dropped in 1996, but never really gone away. One corporate monopoly has replaced another. So much for changing the world. Anyway, some final comments by way of conclusion, if you'll just allow me a couple more minutes. I hope in my lecture this evening I've demonstrated that, as in our daily lives, salt can be found everywhere in modern Indian history, but its fine grains are shaken and scattered so widely that they disappear from view, only rising to the surface at critical moments, such as Gandhi's Salt March of 1930. Like the tides that bring in the salt from the sea, the salt industry itself has ebbed and flowed across the topography and geography of modern India, but leaving little trace, as coastal erosion, the silting up and pollution of rivers, and indeed modern urban development, most spectacularly in your fine city, has covered up and helped to vanish the footprint left by salt. And yet, if we take a closer look, as I've tried to do today, we can see how important salt was in the rise and fall of British dominion in India. Is India a special case? Can we chart the history of modern times through the history of food? Probably not, although there are some wonderful examples out there. To those of you who are both foodies and historians, I recommend studies of the potato in South America, Spanish America, the tomato in the unification of 19th century Italy, and of course tea and sugar in the British Empire. We are learning from a lot of recent work in this field, so much about how consumption and consumerism has shaped our modernity. But in India, we can observe something quite different. The history of salt in India tells us not so much how food nurtured an empire of trade and migration, but rather how the suppression of the production, distribution, and consumption of one commodity kept the British Empire going for so long. The story of salt in modern India reveals how little of this precious foodstuff reached ordinary Indians and how much the British got away with it. Thank you all very much for being a wonderful audience, albeit remotely.
Well, thank you so much, Miles, for that wonderfully wide-ranging talk. What I want to do is to just make a few preliminary comments. I have a couple of questions to which I shall abuse my role as chair to slip in. And then I want to invite the audience to type in your comments in the chat section of the Zoom's chat section, which I will then put to Miles. I'll gather up questions and read them out to Miles, which he can then take up for answer. Okay, I just wanted to start by saying that your paper was in 3 parts and beautifully structured, but I also discerned 3 levels in the way you put together your account, there was clearly at one level a long durée account, sort of a structural account of the political economy of salt over a very long period, over a 200-year period, starting from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th century. But at a second level, this was also a paper that focused on specific sorts of conjunctures, specific turning points. We have 1757, when the English East India Company acquires political power and then uses that to enforce particular forms of monopoly over commercial activities. We have 1857, when the English East India Company gives way to the British Crown, and you have a new phase in the monopoly as well as the production of salt. But you also have at yet another level, a third level, specific sorts of events which give these histories a certain focus. You have, most famously, of course, Gandhi's Salt March, which becomes the point of entry into thinking about these questions. But intriguingly, you also pointed to his involvement in the salt question in 1942, which I think is much less well known. And so it seems to me that this is a paper that is also very rich in the layers, the levels at which it moves and how you integrate these different levels. What struck me were, of course, the many ironies that abound throughout this account. I mean, just to give an example, that the Dandi March happens in the context of a general weakening of the salt monopoly in the 1920s. One would imagine that this would be something that, the salt monopoly and its oppressions would have been at its most intense. And yet, at the time that it actually happened in the 1920s, there was a reversal of these earlier patterns. And that seems to be very interesting. The point you ended with, the fact that the post-colonial state, the post-independent state actually continues with the salt monopoly, that again is quite ironic, it seems to be. I just want to pose a couple of questions which occurred to me from your discussion. One was the turning point of 1857 and the continuance of the salt monopoly at a time, and you said that comparatively speaking, this was a tax that, the monopoly in salt was on its way out in other parts of the world. And you spoke about Lytton, who was overseeing this, who actually had, as you pointed out, diplomatic experience in Europe and so on. So I'm very interested in the intellectual rationale for the monopoly, not simply the fact that it was very useful for them to have this in terms of the revenue generated, but the intellectual terms in which they justified this in the era of free trade. What were the kinds of arguments that were presented? The second question is actually partly a comment, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on it. It seems to me that you're pointing to a very interesting space in which one can think of what Sabyasachi Bhattacharya has talked about in his writing, which is a micro-history of the colonial state. That in a sense, salt is a site in which one can actually write about a micro-history of the state, because it goes down to, it's a very basic item of consumption, but it's also an item that opens up a space for all kinds of exercises of colonial governmentality, to use a term from a Foucauldian term. And I just wondered, as a corollary to that, so it seems to me that that's something that there's a history waiting to be written of this kind of micro history of the state, but also it seems to be a micro history of everyday acts of resistance against the salt tax. In a sense, when you look at Gandhi and the Salt March, you're thinking of something very spectacular, this big moment of collective action. But it seems to me that there must be these histories of resistances, everyday acts around the production and manufacture of salt, which seems to be waiting to be recovered, and that your paper is an invitation to think about how one might write both a new history of the colonial state, but also new histories of resistance involving salt, which can put the Gandhian sort of moment in its context. And then one final irony that sort of strikes me in relation to the interaction between the British and Indian society over the question of salt is that it seems to me that by regularizing, standardizing, and making uniform the multifarious practices around the production, marketing, and tax extraction around salt, the British actually create conditions for a common experience that cuts across India. that the variability that existed before gave rise to more common experience, which then Gandhi is perhaps able to build on in constructing a political movement that has resonances across regions. So these were just some thoughts, but my central question, I suppose, is that one of the intellectual rationale around the the sort of salt monopoly in the late 19th century.
Thank you very much, Prashant, for a range of really helpful comments and interventions. And I'm so pleased that you enjoyed the lecture. It's kind of ironic that all this talk about South Asian dimensions and Indian history, you take me back to the Victorians in the 1860s, which of course is really the only thing I know about. But no, I would just underline what you're saying, that I think there is a very big debate in British India circles in the 1860s and the 1870s. It goes on for about 20 years. A lot of British officials in the south of India do not want the salt tax. There are resignations over it. They do see it as a backward step, and partly they don't want to have to share the burden of supporting the North Indian economy. So I think there's a lot to go into, except a lot of it is rather detailed political economy of a fairly recherche Victorian kind. But thank you too for your other comments, particularly on how we might be looking at a microhistory of the colonial state and violence in particular. And I think I couldn't have formulated some of my arguments without the work of Tanuja Kotial and others who have actually looked at what the changes from the 18th century traditional, if you like, for want of a better word, economy of salt trade, to the much more regulated system. And I think all of those micro studies are really taking us in the right direction. And yes, I think you're right on that last point, that without probably realizing it, the British are creating a common experience across India. I think one of the interesting things in the 1920s, around the time that Viceroy Reading makes a very silly political judgment, I think, is you begin to get research on the history of the salt monopoly coming out of Calcutta University, a series of studies. And so people for the first time know more about its operation, which is 45, and they say, oh, why doesn't Bengal develop its own salt industry? That kind of amnesia and then to top it all, in 1935, the British take it out of the hands of the individual presidencies, make it a national regulated system.
Yeah. Well, as I said, please type your questions in the chat box. But if anyone wants to ask a question in oral form, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Agamani, who points to the role of the Kakatiya kings in salt administration. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, on that point, I mean, Lytton, when he makes the announcement of the new regulations in 1878, says, well, we're just doing what has been done before.
Yes.
This was a feature of Mughal administration, when it's quite the opposite, because
yes.
The Mughal system is much more like the classic Ottoman tax farming system, and it's much more about rent and extracting rent, which is what after all happens in Bengal partly, than trying to extract revenue.
Yeah.
May I ask a question, Prashant?
Yeah, sure, Manjari.
So that was a fascinating talk, Miles. Can you throw some light on, the experience of the other colonies of Britain, as in the policies which were followed in India, which you traced? Can you throw some light on that?
So there are several parts which are fairly obvious of the empire, which are drawn into the Indian system of salt regulation. And I think the role of Egypt, the role of Aden, modern-day Yemen, some of the new British protectorates along the Eastern African coast in the 1890s, 1900s is very important. the British are also very interested in what the Italians do in Eritrea, in Somalia, where they really aggressively developed the salt industry there in the 1930s and through the war. And indeed, of course, Italy is one of the few European states that still has on-off systems of salt regulation well into the 20th century. So I think there's a lot of cross-imperial comparisons, but by and large, the British get rid of it in most places. And I think I just alluded to it, the one really interesting example is when they move into the Ottoman Empire and they take over and occupy Egypt, then actually the salt tax is not something that they turn to as a means of revenue extraction. And you know, there's also a parallel history here of salt duties in England itself, and they've virtually all gone completely by the end of the 18th century. But no, it's a good comparative point. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we have a question, Miles, from Morgan Rodrigues. What was the need to import salt into India? Was it scarcity of salt in India? This is a question from Morgan Rodrigues.
It's partly political and it's partly economic. So if you suppress Indian production of salt, you need to make sure that you've got enough salt being provided, even if it's the bare minimum. And there are actually only a few regions, largely coastal Bombay and coastal Madras, that are self-sufficient, that actually can supply enough of their own salt. Once you suppress the industry in Bengal, you've got to get salt in there. But at the same time, you've stopped the smuggling of salt from the Rajput states and from northwest India. So you've got to make sure that there is sufficient salt going into Bengal. So it's partly managing the supply so that the interior of India and also Bengal gets sufficient but not too much salt. So imported salt is an important part of that. The other aspect of salt imports is that it's the British doing what they did, and here's a question coming up on that, in China. So the British idea of free trade is that Indians must take our salt, must take our Cheshire salt, just as the Chinese must take our opium. So they're forcing open the salt market because the British want to make profits, and indeed they do. Sorry.
Right. So we've got a couple of questions on the chat, but I also see Indra Munshi raising her hand. So I'm going to give Indra her chance to ask a question, and I'm going to read out the other questions on the chat in just a moment. So Indra, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
This is a comment,
yes,
and
yes.
Brief comment. I just take off from what you said, that there are many micro histories of the state, and one such micro history was with respect to toddy, a drink which was very popular with the Adivasis, and over which there was a lot of debate whether it was nourishing, not nourishing, intoxicating, etc., etc. However, when the British taxed the toddy trees, it greatly affected and infuriated the Adivasi communities in Western India, for example, and their everyday acts of resistance, which you also referred to, were they remained a major source of irritation to the administration. There were all kinds of ingenious ways to, to overcome the taxation policy of the British. And anyway, I just wanted to point this out. Thank you.
If I may, Prashant,
yeah, go on. Yeah, respond. Yeah,
very important point. I mean, you could tell this story via abkari as well as via salt. And I think one of the interesting things specifically about the toddy tax is that it does mobilize women during 1930 during the Satyagraha. So I've actually seen a photograph of women Satyagrahis protesting outside the building, the Bombay Town Hall, over the issue of toddy licenses. And of course, Gandhi makes a lot, not just out of salt and salt resistance during the march, but also defying both consumption and the taxes on it of intoxicating liquors. It's a very crucial part, and I think it's a very important part of the way in which he mobilizes youth, mobilizes women in 1930, who then, when he is arrested at the beginning of May, very much take up the civil disobedience campaign. And again, more needs to be written. There's quite a lot we know about what happens in Bombay in the summer of 1930, but we really need to know much more about the other side of India, what's happening in Madras, because it's as extensive a phenomenon of civil disobedience, and my understanding is that it's much more ruthlessly policed, out of the public eye, away from Western India, away from all the international spotlight that Gandhi is receiving. So thank you very much for that point. It's a very important one.
Yes. Thank you, Indra. Now we've got 3 questions here. I'm going to quickly read them out to you, Miles. One is from Dhaval Kulkarni, and it says, can you suggest books, papers, or online resources for background reading on this issue? A second question from Neeta, I think it's Neeta Kanpekar, if I'm not mistaken. Do you find any similarities between the smuggling of salt and opium during the early 19th century? And a question finally from Wispy. Kolkata has a suburb called Salt Lake. Would that have been where an earlier Salt Lake existed? Do you want to take those questions, Mike?
Let me take them in reverse, if I may. Yeah. So thank you very much, Wispy, and thank you again to the Society for honouring me with the opportunity of talking to you this evening. It's been a really great experience. You know, I did go into the town hall when I was in Mumbai in January and felt very much the atmosphere, and wish I could be with you. Anyway, Salt Lake, yes, I think that one of the pictures I showed of Calcutta, the Prinsep picture from the 1820s, that is what is a kind of salt marshy area, and I think, but I'd have to look it up properly, that presumably it's been drained and redeveloped and turned into an area of residence. But there is a wider point, and these references to salt in the topography and geography of modern India can be found everywhere. How much of this we don't know where it is anymore. I spent quite a lot of time with a cartographer trying to work out where a lot of the industry was in the 19th century, and it simply has disappeared, partly because of building development that I alluded to, but particularly simply because of coastal erosion and changes in river patterns. Smuggling of salt, and I don't know enough about smuggling of salt and opium. The stats are there. I mean, the British kept incredible records on prosecutions for smuggling. I think it's a question that demands answering. Smuggling is not something that just occurs because of the British system of regulation. It's already a big phenomenon, we know, from the secondary literature in the 18th and early 19th century. But I think it is very rigorously policed. But I don't really know enough about the comparisons with opium. But again, it's an area where we do need work. And as for suggestions for further reading, it really is surprising. I mean, there is only one main history of the salt administration by Agarwal, and that was published partly officially in the 1930s. There's, of course, Thomas Weber's great book, which recreates the Salt March. And there's a lot of individual case studies, but nothing that really brings everything together. However, with colleagues, particularly Professor Kotyala Dambedkar, we are pulling together a project here, and we'll soon have a website up and running, and that's somewhere where we'll be putting up online resources. So thank you for that cue.
Thank you, Miles. We have a comment from Ajay Agarwal. He says there seems to be a parallel between the way the British strangulated the Indian cotton textile industry to promote the British textile industry, and the way indigenous salt production was slowly killed in Bengal. Do you want to?
Yes, although I would go back to my previous point, but this is about a domestic non-export industry, and the development of the cotton textile industry is highly dependent not just on the British strangulation, which I think is the right word, but also on the international manufacture of cotton, and of course the sea change in what happens in the 1860s with the American Civil War, and then later on what happens to the Lancashire industry in the early 20th century, and indeed into the 1930s, the whole re-emergence of protection across the British Empire. But yes, I think it is the same process of deindustrialization. I think that is the right way to see it. There's a question there about the percentage
of salt revenue generated from the salt tax.
My sense, it's a good question. I've got the data. Is that it's at its highest in the 1890s, around 1900, before the first lowering of the salt duty in 1905. But then just recently, I've been looking at the data for the 1930s, and it's up again. It's partly a question of proportions and also the overall, and of course different grades of salt produce different quality of salt produces different amounts, and because it's a per weight rather than a per sale calculation, that can affect the figures. But basically it's very high, much higher than people have guessed in the late 19th century. It's about 30%, and it's getting back up that way in the 1930s. We can work it out. It's not a complicated calculation.
Yes.
Thank you.
While we wait for further questions, I was just wondering whether you might want to say something, Miles, about the relationship between Gandhi and Indian salt producers. Did they gravitate towards Gandhi, in the 30s after the Dandi March? Were they trying to get him to sort of take on board their demand? And were there, in fact, any sort of close interactions between the Congress and the Indian salt sort of manufacturers lobby, as it were?
Yes, it's a very good question. And in fact, I think you might have asked it a week or so ago, or somebody
yes.
in our seminar series. And much to my embarrassment, I haven't found the answer yet. But we certainly know there was very strong Indian salt manufacturers associations, Calcutta, Karachi, Aden, Bombay, etc. by the 1920s. It's quite hard to track them down. If you look at the official history of the Indian Salt Manufacturers Association, ISMA, which is still around today, they say they only started in 1945, which is clearly not right. But I think I'd need to do more work to find out. But I think there is a convergence of an agenda around a national salt industry emerging in the 1930s. And I think that's why this correspondence between Harry Greenfield and Gandhi through the winter of 46-47, I think, is very important. I've yet to look at Greenfield's papers. He's an interesting character, Harry Greenfield. He goes on to become the UN's expert on opium and heroin in the 1960s, which is, of course, an interesting follow-up career.
Yes, there also seem to be parallels between salt and opium in some ways, it seems to me. But there's some comments here or questions from Usha Vijay Lakshmi and then Neeta Sanghi. Do you want to take? Can you read the comments, Miles? Are you able to read them?
Yes, it's a good point, Usha. It takes us right into something I've alluded to, both the labour process, the system of production whereby salt is refined, and this kind of hierarchy of grades, hierarchy of quality of salt, with so-called, what's now called Himalayan salt and pink salt, and is apparently the preferred choice of the millennials. You know, down to the brackish stuff that's in the estuaries and on the seashore. I think the point about that is that the British were trying very hard to modernize systems of refining and treating salt, but a lot of the long-lasting methods for cleaning the salt, you know, which go way back when, hundreds of years, is something that Gandhi certainly felt this is what, you know, satyagrahis knew how to do. But he was also aware that this is a slightly ambiguous point. So that famous picture of him picking up a handful of salt on the beach at Dundee on the 6th of April didn't actually happen. It's like one of those famous iconic images. That picture was actually taken 3 days later, when he could get to a beach where there was purer salt, or salt that was less black, less flecked with the black sand. So I think this does take us to the heart of both the hierarchy of quality of salt, but also some of the difficulties in presenting a coherent argument about what this salt that everybody should be having actually was.
And then there's a question about whether there's scope for a detailed and nuanced analysis of salt taxation and smuggling in colonial India. That's from Nita Sanghi.
Well, as I say, I do refer you, Nita, thank you for a very good point, to some of the work that is already going on in Rajasthan, on the Punjab, and some of the earlier work actually on Bengal. I think we need more, and on that we need more. There is so much in the archives, and obviously we all hope we can get back to archives soon. But just my initial forays into what's in National Archives of India in Delhi and in some of the state archives shows me that there's an awful lot that we might be looking at here.
I think we have a few more minutes, so I might just ask a further question. Miles, you talked about the comparative dimension, and it was clearly very useful in your argument in framing the anomaly of the British colonial state in India continuing with the salt monopoly and tightening control at a time when other states were relinquishing it. I just wondered whether there's also any parallels in terms of the protest against salt taxation in other contexts that you think might be useful in thinking comparatively about. Are there any examples you've come across?
Well, there's obviously a lot of literature on the early modern period. Yeah. And I do think it's the case that the gabelle in France in the 1780s is unpopular just at the moment when it's not doing what it's meant to be doing, i.e. filling the coffers of Louis XVI's treasury. But not really. I mean, there is a kind of moral economy, I think, at work in a lot of states and countries that still practice the salt monopoly, and it's usually around times of dearth or shortage of food in other areas, where the salt merchants, the salt warehouses, the whole system of salt storage is seen as an improper interference in what should be people's natural right to access to salt. So I think there's quite a lot of that, and I think some of the classic arguments put forward by Edward Thompson and others about the moral economy against the market, and in this case the colonial free trade market, regulated market, might be deployed when we look at 19th century India. Just on that, but it is interesting, in 1930 we do know that there are salt protests in other parts of the British Empire, partly amongst the Indian diaspora, but also in those little pockets here and there, where I think in Sumatra, for example, where some kind of salt regulation does apply.
Yes. I think it's also very significant and interesting that you highlighted the role of Aden in the salt trade, because I think there's some work that's being now done on it, but I think it's a very interesting, Aden's role in the salt trade, I think, is worth sort of, it's a good point that you made there, which I think not many people are aware of. There's a comment, I agree there's a lot of archival, this is from Neeta again, I agree that there's a lot of archival material available. And she says she's worked on the salt trade in Bombay Presidency. Thank you very much, Neeta. I'm sure that will be of great interest to Miles. Any other questions or comments?
May I ask a question?
Yes, Feroza, yeah.
I hope it's relevant. Can you throw some light that, we had this system introduced during the East India Company days and abolished, I think, after independence, the zamindari system. Did the zamindars of Bengal, or what is now Bangladesh, play any role in the salt movement?
In the 1930s?
In the 1930s.
I don't know. I really don't know. I thought you were going to ask about the 1780s.
Well, I said from East India time to till the system was abolished, or even, yes, even from the 18th century, if there's any light you could throw on the role in Eastern India, what is now Bangladesh,
yes.
Bengal,
No, I don't,
East Pakistan, what became East Pakistan.
I mean, two points, if I may, Feroz. I think it's a very, very important issue. I mean, back in the 18th century, the British, in a way, are trying to cut out ironically, the zamindars and the ryots. They take their commission in terms of the land rental, but they don't want them raking anything from the salt workers. So they pretend to be on the side of the salt worker against the zamindars. 1930s, I'm not sure. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there's that happening. And then there are instances in other areas of protests where they do get involved, but I don't know enough about that. What I do know is that after 1947, and admittedly on the other side of the country, salt is one of the few areas where India and Pakistan come to some kind of agreement, particularly over the Kutch and the Sindh salt. And I think it's only one of two treaties that they managed to sign in the years after independence for cooperation. So I think there is a further story, specifically to what you're referring in East Pakistan, modern day Bangladesh. But I think there is also a larger issue here about how salt, if you like, crosses partition well into the 1950s.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. Right, there's a further question from Sudha. How was salt production affected by cyclones and natural calamities? Gosh.
Flooding, essentially. I mean, a certain amount of flooding was necessary to push the salt up the river estuaries and in that sense feed the salt pans. But in the same way that the rice basket areas, low-lying coastal areas which farmed rice, could be completely devastated, particularly in the Bay of Bengal, and with long-term consequences, because once you lose those areas, it's very hard to recreate them. But it does raise a wider issue, and I think it's an important one to mention, is that the British were very happy to turn on and turn off salt production all over India when it suited them. I mean, Bengal is the classic case, but well into the 1920s, the Salt Commissioner reports will refer to, oh, well, we didn't continue manufacturing that particular area because its productivity wasn't very good, or we decided to reopen this area of salt pans because we think we can extract more than usual. It was all about maximizing productivity, maximizing the revenue.
Mrinalini has a question. Mrinalini, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the
Yeah.
question.
Thanks, Miles. That was an excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about the princely estates and salt. So even after they'd been paid off, did salt remain an issue in any way? I'm thinking particularly of Catherine Butler Schofield's work on actually courtesans at the Jaipur court who had, part of their remuneration from the darbar was in the form of salt rights from, the production that the court historically controlled. And when the Brits sort of took this over, I can't remember the name of the particular courtesan, but she just refused to play ball and said, no, look, this is my hereditary right. And it was also a cultural issue about having eaten the salt, eaten the salt of the ruler, as it were. And her rights, as far as she was concerned, derived from that. And there was a particularly, I think, difficult local administrator. And my memory of the situation is that she won her case, basically. She just refused to back down. So thinking also back to the earlier comment about salt being a site of resistance, and this is about the late 19th century. So I just wondered if you had any further comments on that.
I know the work of Catherine, to which you refer. It's a brilliant piece of investigation, and I think it throws up several issues. I mean, one is, and I'm no expert in this, one is this whole cultural symbolism of Namak as trust and loyalty, and the kind of bonds of exchange that are associated with exchanging and sharing salt. And I think that's very, very important, and it needs to be factored in here. The princely states vary enormously. Some like those in Kathiawar or Travancore don't have any problem. They don't have any salt duty. All of this is negotiated in the early 1860s. The Sanads that really provide the foundations for crown government. All these separate treaties with the individual princes all have their salt element to them, and they do vary enormously. So as you refer, in the case of Jaipur, Jodhpur, in return for giving the British the right to extract the revenue, they get a cash sum paid annually, and they also get an equivalent sum of free salt given to the Durbar for distribution. But nobody is really happy with it, and I think the contested status, the contested rights to which you refer, continue well into the 20th century. And indeed, there's a huge report on salt administration in the princely states in the mid-1930s, again adding to this sense that the whole system can't maintain itself anymore, which brings out a huge variety of different deals that have been struck, sometimes with the wider knowledge of the community and the people of individual states, but sometimes as simply as a deal between the local chief and the British officials. So thank you. I think it's a very important intervention.
There are a couple of other questions, Miles, and I think these should be the last questions we take. So do you want to quickly take a look at the two questions? One is again from Nita and one from Ajay Agarwal. Would you like me to read them out?
No, I can see them.
Yeah, okay.
So AJ, thank you. Yes, I don't know a lot about the salt mines in what's now Pakistan. All I know is that almost as soon as the Sikh Wars end, 47 and effectively 49, all of the British mineral experts are flooding in to work out not just how to maximize production from the mines, but actually extend them. They really do see it as a very important source. They're also very aware that it's probably the most smuggled part of the salt resource across India, so that's why it's so heavily policed. But again, there's hardly anything apart from the work I referred to in the lecture that's been written about it. And partly, I guess, because it's just over the border now, and it may not be as possible to get access to the archives.
Salt and Baroda.
Princely states, Baroda. Baroda is interesting. It again strikes its own deal with Britain in the 1860s, 1870s. But of course, Baroda is particularly important in 1930 because part of the march, the Salt March, goes through Baroda. And there's a whole different cadence, a whole different tenor to Gandhi's remarks, what he says at the prayer meetings once he crosses the border. It's a very different kind of rhetoric that he's using to negotiate civil disobedience there. But yes, and of course we know the Baroda State archives are very good, and I think again it's another part of the research that will yield a lot once we get back into the archives. So thank you for that observation.
Right. I think we've had a lot of really interesting questions, and thank you for your patient answers, Miles, and also for a very insightful paper. I think you've covered a lot of ground and given us a lot to think about, and really told us a lot about salt that I'm sure many of us didn't know. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Meenal.
Thank you. Thank you, Prashant. Thank you, Miles. Yes, it gives me great pleasure indeed. Thank both of you. Dr. Taylor, for your compelling exposition and also for the very interesting slides you projected for us with some rare images. And we're happy that you ended with the picture of the town hall, which, for us is, we're very proud to have that picture projected just everywhere around the world. Also, Dr. Kidambi, for your very interesting comments and interventions. I think it's really been an enormous privilege for us to listen to both of you. It has been a most meaningful experience. The depth of knowledge and mastery you have illustrated today is a fitting tribute to Dr. Kamerkar's memory. And we are also grateful to all the participants for gracing this occasion, for their comments and questions, of which there have been many. I think, perhaps a lot of people would have liked this discussion to continue, but all good things have to come to an end. And we are particularly happy that members of Dr. Kamerkar's family are there. And I have to say that incidentally, I also belong to that family, and I'm happy and proud to be part of this family. I also thank the technical team for their support, which is invaluable. So there we come to the end of a wonderful evening. Thank you all. Thank you, our speaker and chairperson for the day. Goodbye. See you soon.
Yeah.
See you
Thank
soon,
you so much, Meenal, and thank you so much for arranging this, and you all stay safe and well.
Yes, everybody stay safe and well. Miles, see you in Mumbai next year.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
So are we.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.